right? Okay. All right. So this is my rundown of the history of life on Earth. So I'm going to draw a timeline on this screen. You don't have to do anything. You just sit there and watch and listen. And hopefully I can give you some good information here. All scientifically based, evidence-based information. So let's pretend that this is a timeline that represents the history of the life on the planet. This would be 3.5 billion years ago. Billion years ago, which is when we think the very first forms of life appeared on the planet. And then way over here is the present day, today, this moment, right now. Okay, so time is going from all the way back there to all the way to the present. And the evidence that we have for the information I'm going to give you here, much of it is fossil evidence. Much of it is fossils that have been found and then radioactively dated so that we know how old the rocks are that the fossils were found in. So given that, the Earth's history is actually divided into 4 different really big eras. An era is a period of time, right? So the first era is the longest one. It's called the Precambrian Era. And the Precambrian Era is the longest one. It's also kind of the most boring one. That is absolutely correct. That's how we separate one era from another, is that the Precambrian era ended when there was a big extinction event and then gave rise to the next era, which is called the Paleozoic Era. This is the Paleo. Not quite. Not quite. Everybody thinks that, but I'm glad you didn't put dinosaurs in the Precambrian. That's good. A lot of people make that mistake. Paleozoic Era is the next one, right? And then after that is the Mesozoic, and that's where the dinosaurs are, right here. Mesozoic Era is right here. And then finally, the era that we showed up in is called the Cenozoic Era. Okay. Excuse me. And in between these lines here, the way we separate one era from another is by some big extinction event where suddenly the fossils really change in nature between the eras. So extinction events means that something happened to the planet. In this case, it has a name. The Permian extinction almost wiped everything out altogether. The Permian extinction. And that, we think, had to do with the Earth's crust breaking apart and a tremendous amount of climate change that changed the weather on the planet so much that it just killed just about everything. But luckily, life came back from that, and the Mesozoic Era came along. And then this is the famous meteor that hit right here. The meteor that hit the Yucatan Peninsula, that killed off all the dinosaurs and made way for the Cenozoic Era, right? Okay. So there's these extinction events that separate the eras. All right. So in order to kind of characterize the Earth, what it was like within each era, let me just kind of go back, way back to the beginning of life, right? So first of all, way back here, what was the Earth like 3.5 billion years ago? What was it like? Well, it definitely wasn't anything like it is now. Yes, Ariel? I'm sorry, I can't hear you, dear. You know, that's actually pretty good. It was definitely, the atmosphere was poisonous. The temperatures were bad. There wasn't a lot of water. And the sky was probably about the same color as the sky on Venus, orange, they think. because there wasn't any oxygen in the air, and it's the oxygen that has made our planet more blue. Yeah. Dana, did you have a question?
No, just you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. So, yeah, so the Earth was an extremely different place at the beginning of life. By 3.5 billion years, I mean, I could have gone back to 4.5 billion years, but there really wasn't much life there, and I want to talk about life today. So the first life, what do you think the first life was like? Tiny, simple. First life was bacteria, really. Very simple bacteria. Did somebody say it? Good. That's excellent. Yes, Benke's got it right. Prokaryotic life, we think, was the first life. And we actually have fossil evidence of bacteria that's extremely old. Believe it or not, bacteria can actually fossilize. They can affect the colors and the shapes of rock fossils that are really, really, really old. So we do have evidence of that. So we have this first bacterial life. You go a little bit further and remember that the Ariel's absolutely right. The air and the atmosphere on the planet there was no oxygen, okay? So there was no oxygen. The air would have been toxic to us. The air was toxic. The water was just starting to gather, all right? Air toxic. Here is where we got our first photosynthesis, and we had the first oxygen gas. And that made a lot of other things possible after that. The first oxygen gas. We also had here, we had about the first eukaryotic cells came along. Right? So it had been pretty simple bacteria for all this time, and then suddenly you have the first eukaryotic cells. Now remember that that's not a huge change, except that now you have a nucleus in there, right? And the eukaryotic cells that existed then were not making multicellular organisms yet. They were still single-celled, right? They were still single-celled eukaryotes. We're still single-celled eukaryotes. And for example, you might have had stuff that looked like amoebas swimming around, right? Amoeba is a much more advanced creature than a bacteria. It's much bigger, it's much more complicated. It has mitochondria in it, it has nucleuses in it. It's quite a large predator in the world of bacteria, right? But to us, an amoeba is just one tiny little thing on a microscope. But back then, that was a big deal. Those first eukaryotic cells, maybe the parameciums that you've seen, those also first eukaryotic cells, right? Okay, and maybe not until this point you had the first multicellular creatures, right? And again, you're not talking about things that are that amazing. You're talking about coral and jellyfish, which may seem very simple creatures to us, but we're getting pretty complicated if you're only dealing with amoeba and paramecium, right? Worms were the most complicated animals around back then. Okay. So then, and then another thing that you need to know is all of the life here, all of this life is in the water. Life in the oceans, and maybe lakes and small ponds, right? Okay, so nothing on land. Land invasion happens here, Paleozoic Era. This is the age, it's the age of land invasion. First plants, first land plants like ferns, first insects, first frogs. There was actually an age of amphibians that kind of happened during this. You had the first lizards, maybe. Right? Okay, so that was the Paleozoic Era. Mesozoic Era is the one everybody loves because that's the age of the dinosaurs, right? That's the age of the terrible lizards, the dinosaurs. And a lot of people remember the Mesozoic, but look how far along we are, right? for most of the history of life on Earth, life is pretty simple, and it gets a little bit more complex and a little bit more complex. The dinosaurs are actually pretty recent in terms of the whole timeline of the planet. There was an awful lot of long span of time where there was nothing more than just single-celled things in the water. Not very fascinating stuff. It took a long time for evolution to produce the dinosaur. So yes. Yeah, that's here. First oxygen gas was the oxygen revolution, because before that, you couldn't have aerobic respiration, could you? Yeah.
Some people are asking questions. How did water form on Earth? Ice crystals from meteorites.
That's one thing. They think comets might have brought some of it. That's correct. There's a lot of theories about it. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we don't know for certain. But we do have a lot of evidence of what I'm putting on the screen here. The evidence for this stuff is fossil evidence and radioactive dating evidence. Okay, so age of dinosaurs. The other thing that happened in the Mesozoic era is that there are the first birds here, which is kind of neat. The first birds. Birds are very old. They've been around as long as the dinosaurs were. And then the Cenozoic era is the age of mammals. Once the dinosaurs were knocked out by that meteor, mammals began to rise. Animals with mammary glands and fur, and eventually people. Yes. Humans, yeah. Well, humans didn't appear until the last fingernail of time over here. We were very, very recent arrivals. Yes.
Yeah, humans, like the modern day humans only been around, like modern day humans first popped up around like 200,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's maybe a little bit more recent. Yeah, there's some questions about exactly where the first Homo sapien actually came. But yeah, that's about right. Really more like 100 or 50,000 years ago, maybe even that. But in any case, very recent. Okay, so that is my history of life on Earth. Was that 10 minutes? Was it? Oh, I did it. Oh, I'm so proud. Okay, so obviously there's a lot more I could insert here, but I don't want to overwhelm you. Just I want to make sure that you realize that when you see the Ed puzzle that you're going to do later, they turn this on its, they make it vertical. You'll see a lot of vertical timelines where the 3.5 billion years is at the bottom and it moves up. And then they don't really show the Precambrian era to be as long as they should show it. A lot of the pictures that you'll see don't really make the Precambrian era long enough. It's much, much longer than the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic eras. But the thing is, way more interesting things happened in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras. So that's usually why they can't fit it on the page, right? Because nothing happened in the Precambrian era. But it was a very, very long time. Yes.
How do we adopt our immune system?
Well, you're talking about the process of natural selection and evolution, right? Which is going to be something we'll talk about in classes to come. But I'm glad you're asking that question, because the evolution of, like, for example, something like upright walking was a physical and anatomical adaptation, but we also have adaptations to our immune systems and what our white blood cells are able to fight when infections come on us. And that is correct. You're right about that. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording this for now.